Staying on the continent's politics, the dethroning of the Botswana Democratic Party from power after 58 years in office has raised questions over liberation movements and their relevance in Southern Africa. For this discussion, I'm now joined by Musa Mdunge, an international relations specialist at the University of Dundee in Scotland. Musa, good to speak to you. Obviously, plenty shock, I think, particularly by the old guard in the SADC region following the change in power, if you will, from the old guard to the new guard. Your take on these results in the Botswana election?
Thank you so much for having me, and good evening to you and to the viewers. Look, the election results in Botswana, they represent a consequential moment. You know, we are clearly seeing a wave in Southern Africa of democracies, of democracies turning their back against the ruling parties of old. And Botswana's election results represent such a moment where the Botswana people have really decided that after years of the ruling party being in control, and yet the lived experience of the people having deteriorated over the years, that it was clearly a time for change. But one thing you see here as well, which is quite common among ruling parties, is where there are huge levels of factional battles, as was the case with the BDP, as has been the case with the African National Congress in South Africa. Those parties then tend later in terms of their electoral support to decrease. So in many ways, this was in the writings for Botswana. The interesting thing now is the level of maturity, both by the BDP, but also the UDC, to see this moment for what it is and ensure a peaceful transition. And that we must applaud the Botswana, that they've been able to do that.
Now, I suppose one of the most common denominators when you look at South Africa, you look at Botswana and potentially Mozambique, as I'd imagine the entire African continent, is that the average age of those that are voting is pretty young. The median age for Africa is about 19. Just how critical are young voters, particularly unemployed young voters, in determining who wins the elections?
Well, young people are very, very important, given, as you've put it, their demographic size and their importance in terms of both the economy of their countries, but the politics of their country. Young people are going to determine the future trajectory of each of their countries, whether we think of Botswana, South Africa, Mozambique. The problem we have here is that the political leadership tends to be of an older generation, where there is a disconnect between the interests and the aspirations of young people, as well as the interests and the aspirations as interpreted by that leadership. And so the election of the new, president of Botswana, who happens to be 54 years of age, is very interesting, because we are starting to see this generational move happening in the African continent. Though it has been slow, particularly in Southern Africa, there's certainly momentum, because at the end of the day, all of these countries' governments have got to answer one fundamental question. Do you have a vision and a plan for the people of your country, particularly for young people, that they can aspire to remain and build, rather than go overseas, for example, and try their life overseas? And so the key thing for African leaders currently is, what is the vision and policies that we are producing that will ensure that we retain talent of young people within our countries, that we are not seeing almost what we had in South Africa called the wasted years. And I think we are still to see the ramification of the wasted years in terms of certain generations in the future. And so young people represent a huge, important moment right now for Botswana, for South Africa, and for other countries. The problem is how they've voted. Won't it translate into actual change where they are a part of it, rather than being recipients of that change? The question is still to be answered.
Well, the one question that also needs to be answered is, how important is it in liberation movements remaining relevant and coming up with a strategy that resonates with young people? Because the old guard continually talks about the
Yeah.
historical roles that they've played in independence. In Botswana, the Botswana Democratic Party did not necessarily have to fight for liberation, but they facilitated it, a little bit different from
Yes.
the African National Congress or ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, for instance.
Indeed, liberation movements, like any modern political party, has to present a vision that they are able to sell to their people and be able to bring the people around that very vision. And so while there was currency to liberation movements calling on that historical nostalgia in order to maintain their legitimacy to remain in power, those sort of arguments no longer hold space the longer a country moves away from the date by which they became an independent country. And that's the lesson that we are seeing in Southern Africa. It's not to say that Southern Africa is necessarily unique in this case. It is just that given the decolonial project only hit Southern Africa late in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, unlike, for example, West Africa or North Africa in the 50s and 60s, the tradition of ruling party of liberation movements is still fresh in our minds. But the key thing here is how do liberation movements get out of that psyche of thinking of themselves in that way, and rather they need to start thinking of themselves as modern political parties that need to have a message for young people, a message for different constituencies, where they need to use technology in a new, innovative way in order to communicate with society and bring society towards the table. But also, ruling parties today, like liberation movements, have also got to then factor in other stakeholders that in the struggle they may have not. The role, for example, of business in terms of the governance of a country. For example, you think of Botswana, a huge dependency on diamonds. Yet for the past few years, economic growth has been quite low. So these are some of the challenges that liberation movements have got to be conscious of, that it's no longer enough for you to depend on the legitimacy of historical nostalgia, but rather you have to now be relevant to the challenges, the issues, the aspirations of your people at the time. And literally what we are witnessing in Botswana and what we witnessed in South Africa a few months ago speaks to that failure by ruling parties to make that diagnosis and that change and shift in strategy.
Well, so you talked about a wave in the SADC region, maybe a wave on the African continent, where liberation movements are seemingly losing power. Now, one would imagine that after South Africa's or the demise of the ANC in the election on May 29th, that other young people across the SADC region who are scheduled to vote this year are watching. Botswana could be a point in an example. We've got Namibia, the Namibians who are voting in November. Are they likely to face similar challenges?
They are likely to face similar challenges because when you look across Southern Africa, what the common thread among these countries is huge levels of youth unemployment. That seems to be the driving characteristic of the challenges that the region is facing. And that has to do with multiple factors. For example, the very structure of the Southern African political economy is such where the very industries are saturated, overdeveloped, and no longer have space and room for growth that would be able to create jobs. And so whether you think Namibia, Botswana, it's all going to flow the same way. And given that Namibia's economy is quite integrated with South Africa, if South Africa is not growing, and I think this point I would really want us to emphasize, that if South Africa doesn't grow, the region will not grow. And that is the thing that even our leaders have got to think about. So as it pertains to Namibia, definitely you are likely to see SWAPO face a challenge in terms of their own electoral support, but the question is going to be, can they sell a story not only about the past, but about the future? And if they're able to sell that story to the Namibian people, they may be the one liberation movement that survives what is clearly a wave of rejection of liberation movement politics in Southern Africa.
Final question, Musa, before we let you go, speaks to how important is it for political parties, particularly liberation movements on the African continent, where the leadership is largely much older than the young people that they represent, to engage these young people in coming up with policies and trying to find solutions for young people, if obviously they want to stay in office?
Well, it is the way in which you build your machinery, right? So let's use the African National Congress, for example. To understand its demise over the past 30 years, you must understand the demise of the organizational footprint in society. Given that all of a sudden you are now in power, the liberation movement is no longer seen as a vehicle by which, when people have challenges or problems or complaints about the state of governance, they can trust that this organization, though it is the ruling party, still maintains a revolutionary vigor in terms of the social and economic issues. So for liberation movements to remain relevant, they've got to build the organizational footprint within society. They've got to strengthen those local links. And if in local government you are suffering, that is where that organizational footprint will be able to help buffer and ensure the legitimacy of that movement in the eyes of the people. But secondly, they also need to ensure a generational mix in leadership in order to ensure that you've got the advantage of the kind of energy and innovation that young people are able to bring, but you also need the experience, the wisdom, the fortitude, the strategy that comes with experience that an older generation can be. So it isn't a throwing out of one generation versus the other, but you've got to see a greater integration, a generational mix. And if African countries, Southern African countries, the ruling parties are able to do that, that may then move the needle, even in terms of the type of policies that they produce, because one gets a sense that we are really at a stage where people are out of policy ideas. And then you need to start questioning who is in the room and who's making those decisions. And in many ways, the results in Botswana speak to that failure to integrate young people within the governance to ensure that the solutions that are being produced there represent the aspirations and the interests of the people wholly. And not only that the people can then be able to own those solutions, which is very important.